Last time, we saw the British Crusader plan unravel even more, as Gott pushed 7th Armoured Brigade towards Tobruk, the 4th Armoured Brigade got hit hard by the 15th Panzer Division, and the British command misinterpreted the entire situation over and over, deciding to order the Tobruk breakout attempt before they defeated the German panzers. And, thanks in part to the BBC, Crüwell was able to persuade Rommel that this was actually a British attack, and Rommel finally decided to react. The Desert Fox is now on the hunt. Well, sort of. He's released the hounds at least. Crüwell is actually the one on the hunt. The two Panzer Divisions are now gathered together and heading straight for Sidi Rezegh to smash 7th Armoured Brigade and the 7th Support Group there. So the question is, will the British be devoured in the great tank battle that's about to occur? Let's find out. Notes and sources are in the pinned comment, timestamps to various parts of the video are in the description. Overnight, Crüwell brought 21st Panzer Division to 15th Panzer Division, and Gatehouse and Scott Coburn had also prepared their 2 brigades for battle. The British tank commanders could have asked for help from Freyberg's division, but their overconfidence and their immature tank doctrine once again clouded their judgment. Crüwell then ordered both his divisions to move north and then west to hit 7th Armoured Brigade in the rear. So, as the panzers raced off to the northeast, Norrie now hoped that Scott Coburn and Gatehouse would also catch the panzers in the rear. Unfortunately, Gatehouse's M3 light tanks were slow to start. They had been delayed because of refuelling and boggy ground, so didn't manage to catch up to the Afrika Korps, leaving Scott Coburn's Crusaders to chase the panzers on their own. However, even the Crusaders didn't engage them quick enough. The German rearguards put up a strong delaying action by counterattacking the Crusaders. The British did manage to repulse this attack, then regroup and launch another attack on the panzers, but this second attack came up against 88mm guns and they lost several tanks. The result, to quote Playfair, was the jaws of the British armour did not close on the Panzer Divisions as everyone had been hoping they would. Norrie interpreted the move of the German panzers towards Sidi Rezegh to mean that they were withdrawing. So, at 0845 hours, Norrie reported to Cunningham that the 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades were following behind the Panzer Divisions, and Norrie also recommended that 13th Corps be unleashed upon the Germans. Cunningham was pleased to hear that the German armour was retreating, and agreed with Norrie's suggestion. He therefore rang Godwin Austen and told him to advance as he pleased. Cunningham wanted the New Zealanders and 7th Brigade of the 4th Indian Division to go north in support of the advance, and help 30 Corps get to Tobruk. So, Godwin Austen ordered the New Zealand Division, with their infantry tanks in support, to advance along the Tre Capuzzo towards Sidi Rezegh and Tobruk, and he also ordered the 4th Indian Division to take the Axis positions at the Sidi and Libyan Omars. In Cairo, by a conspiracy of foolishness between press and public relations, the victory was announced to the world with vulgar flamboyance. Since the beginning of the offensive, the press had destroyed more German tanks than Rommel had ever possessed, 3 times heavier losses than those of Cunningham. There were stories of 40,000 men being encircled south of Tobruk. Meanwhile, with the breakout order given, morale was boosted for the men of the Tobruk garrison. Scobie's sappers quickly cleared minefields and barbed wire, and erected 4 bridges over the anti-tank ditch in preparation for their advance. 50 Matilda tanks, as well as infantry from the 32nd Tank Brigade, 14th Infantry Brigade and 16th Infantry Brigade waited for the signal to attack. The hope was that Scobie would meet up with the 7th Armoured Brigade at El Duda at around 1600 hours. At dawn, the breakout began. A diversionary attack took place, with the Polish Brigade attacking the Pavia Division, where they overran one company, and the 23rd Infantry Brigade also attacking the Italians elsewhere. But to the southeast, a powerful bombardment by over 100 guns stunned and suppressed the Italians defending the perimeter. With D Squadron of 7th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment leading the way, Scobie's garrison began to fight its way out of Tobruk. The 2nd King's Own Battalion was on the right flank, the 2nd Black Watch Battalion was in the centre, and the 2nd Queen's Own Battalion was on the left flank. 4th Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment found the going tough, and it's no wonder. They thought that they would be attacking the Bologna Division, so they were surprised to find not just Italians, but Germans from the Africa Division in their way. This combined Axis force were well dug in behind barbed wire defences and minefields. Despite starting well, the attack soon slowed due to heavy opposition and delays caused by bottlenecks in the advance. The British were under heavy Axis artillery and machine gun fire, with resistance so stubborn that 4th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment actually fell behind the advance of the infantry of Chappell's 14th Infantry Brigade. The Black Watch lost 200 men and their commanding officer. Even so, several of the German and Italian strongpoints were taken by the British. The fighting around Tiger position was intense, and it fell to the 1st and 4th Battalions Royal Tank Regiment and 2nd Black Watch. But the objectives beyond this remained out of reach due to stiff German and Italian resistance. The Italians at the Togun strongpoint were especially determined to hold on. British attacks were now being thrown back, and so desperate were the Germans to contain the Tobruk garrison that Rommel himself rushed up from Gambut with 4 88mm guns and used them to stem the tide. The sally had partly succeeded though, and 70th Division had not only won a salient nearly 4,000 yards into the Axis lines, but had taken 550 Germans and 527 Italian prisoners. That said, Scobie couldn't push on towards El Duda due to the strong Axis counterattacks. If a link-up was going to occur this day, 7th Armoured Division would need to break through to him, and Scobie was receiving some depressing reports from the south. Gott planned to send parts of 7th Armoured Brigade and the support group, both under Davy's overall command, north from Sidi Rezegh airfield. He wanted to take part of the ridge overlooking the Tre Capuzzo. The right of this attack would be conducted by 1st Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, the left would be conducted by 6th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, followed by 1 company of 2nd Battalion the Rifle Brigade. Artillery support was provided by 3rd and 4th Battalions of the Royal Horse Artillery and 60th Field Regiment, which was at battalion strength. Once the objective had been gained, 6th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment were to move down past Sidi Rezegh and link up with the Tobruk sortie at El Duda. However, at 0800 hours, half an hour before the attack was to begin, German tanks were spotted approaching from the southeast. These were the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, which had advanced from Gabra-Saleh. This was a little bit concerning, to say the least. The British still had their orders to break through to Tobruk, but 2 Panzer Divisions were about to hit them in the rear. And because the sally from Tobruk had already begun, Brigadier Davy felt it was too late to alter the original plan. So, with German panzers incoming, Campbell took over the northern attack, which would proceed as planned, and this would allow Davy to defend against the German armour with the rest of 7th Armoured Brigade, which he diverted to the south. Gathering the 7th Hussars, the 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, and the remainder of the support group, he hoped he could stem the tide. At 0830 hours, Campbell started the attack north, with a 4-minute barrage by the 25-pounders. Covered by a smokescreen, the British advanced quickly, getting caught in the tail end of their own artillery bombardment. Luckily they didn't suffer casualties from this, and they overran several Italian and German positions. But as the British armoured cars reached the lip of the escarpment, they found the 100-yard wide slope in front of them was dotted with a host of German and Italian positions. A hail of small arms fire greeted them, forcing them to swing right to the eastern edge. During this movement, the carriers were being picked off, hit by German anti-tank guns from the far ridge. Some of the British infantry bailed out and continued on foot, and having completed the manoeuvre, the other carriers stopped and allowed their riflemen to get out as well. The British now began to return fire and assault the Axis positions. Platoons used leapfrog tactics to get close to the enemy before grenades and a final assault was called for. More infantrymen came forwards from the airfield and were also hit by incoming fire. After his company was pinned down by heavy fire, Rifleman John Bealey of A Company 1st Battalion Royal King's Rifle Corps got to his feet and charged forwards against an enemy anti-tank gun. Having wiped out the defenders of the position with his Bren gun, he was cut down by enemy fire coming from elsewhere. For his sacrifice, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. By noon, Campbell had secured the escarpment. 600 to 700 German and Italian prisoners had been taken, with the bodies of another 400 killed on the battlefield. For this, the British had lost 84 men. And with the escarpment in their hands, the tanks could go forwards. So, 6th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment advanced on the left across 2,000 yards of open ground. It rolled over the track and moved across the ridge towards the Tre Capuzzo and El Duda. It was then that they were hit by German 88mm guns, the same four that Rommel had halted the breakout of Tobruk with. In addition, Camp Group Vekmar had appeared, helping to blunt Campbell's advance north. The Crusaders, which reached the reverse slope of the escarpment, were knocked out completely, one after another. And after this sharp action, 6th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment had lost 3/4 of its tanks and was now down to just 28 operational tanks. As all this was happening, Davy and his HQ were on the southern escarpment south of Point 178. They gathered a handful of tanks, 30 or so cruisers and 20 Crusaders, from the 7th Hussars and placed them in front of the advancing enemy panzers. Davy also had a battery of artillery and a reserve force, the cruisers of 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, close by. He still thought that this was a minor threat, although was sceptical of the reports stating that the Afrika Korps had been defeated. He believed that, at most, he faced one Panzer Division, and thought that 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades were attacking them from the rear. And yes, 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades were following behind the Panzer Division, but the problem was they weren't really engaging them. So Davy had completely misjudged the situation. Davy's 30 tanks were about to be struck by somewhere in the region of 220 panzers supported by 2 infantry regiments, lots of artillery, engineers, anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns, and so on. As it was, the combined force of the most famous armoured corps in the world at the time was sweeping down upon 2 battalions of outdated tanks spread across some 10 miles of desert, with a single battery of artillery somewhere between them. Now, before we get into this engagement, we're going to do what the official British history does and stop to look at the overall situation, because it's simply ridiculous. This is, in fact, what makes Crusader so unique in the annals of history. I don't know of another battle which is anything like this. Just look at the positions. From north to south we have British troops of the 70th Division who have broken out of Tobruk, the Italian Bologna and German Africa Divisions facing both north, south and west, part of the 7th Support Group facing north, and the other part of the 7th Support Group as well as the 7th Armoured Brigade facing south, 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions facing north, and they were being chased by the 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades. From the front of the Tobruk sortie to the open desert southeast of Sidi Rezegh airfield, the forces of both sides were sandwiched like the layers of a Neapolitan ice. A complicated situation indeed, which, if suggested as a setting of a training exercise, must have been rejected for the reason that in real life these things simply could not happen. Well, it has happened, and it highlights just how bad the Crusader plan has unravelled. Why is the British armour split up like this? What were the British thinking? This couldn't have happened to any other army. Only the British army could screw up this bad, which is great because it makes for entertaining history. Just imagine the confusion on the ground. The commanders weren't seeing this as we are now. They were in the middle of this mess. They're relying on radio, reports, and their own eyes, any of which could be wrong, so they didn't know exactly where friendly units were, and they certainly didn't know much about the enemy movements. So it's crazy, and it's no wonder Davy didn't know what was about to hit him. The first vehicles came into sight at 0830 hours, but these weren't German. They were British soft-skin vehicles which were fleeing from the Panzers, but intermixed with them were the German anti-tank gunners who quickly deployed and began to shell Davy's tanks with their 50mm packs. The Hussars could not return fire because the German guns outranged their 2-pounder guns, plus they were concerned about hitting their own soft-skin vehicles which were in the way. The German assault struck hard against the 7th Hussars. The Panzers drove straight forwards, firing shot after shot, and because the reserve force from 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment was held back by the German anti-tank screen, its position actually pushed 15th Panzer Division to the right, meaning that it was closer to 21st Panzer Division and therefore delivered an even heavier blow against the Hussars. The Panzers passed straight through the Hussars and their supporting field guns, splitting the British in two. In the smoke and dust, an intense swirling fight broke out. Both the 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades were in no hurry to engage the Germans, since they believed they'd beaten them already, and so they took their time. It actually took them several hours to move over the same ground it took the Panzer Divisions just one. It was late morning now, and 22nd Armoured Brigade was sat on the flank of 15th Panzer Division, taking shots at the German lorries and cars. They claimed to have destroyed 200 German vehicles before running low on fuel and withdrawing, but there's no mention of these losses in the Afrika Korps diary. As both brigades watched the Afrika Korps disappear over the northwest horizon, they'd considered that they'd thoroughly beaten the Germans. Meanwhile, 7th Hussars were being eaten alive. Towards the end of the morning, the Panzers ran low on fuel and ammunition, and 15th Panzer Division on their left realised that they had 2nd Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment on their flank, but also another force of armour had moved up from the southwest. This was the 22nd Armoured Brigade. All this caused the Germans to disengage. The Panzers moved to the eastern end of the valley to refuel, allowing 7th Hussars to count their losses. Because the Germans were aiming for the airfield and beyond, hoping to destroy everything they came across, 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment suffered little damage by comparison to the Hussars. 7th Hussars lost all their Crusaders and all but 10 of their cruisers in this fight. Effectively, they'd been wiped out. At this point, as the German panzers crowded around their ammunition and petrol trucks to resupply, 2 troops of South African armoured cars went forwards to observe them and count the German panzers. They passed some tanks of 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment who were sat hull down along a ridge. A party of 25 panzers detached to chase these cars away, and as they did so, drove out of the range of their own anti-tank guns and into the range of the 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment's cruisers. 5 panzers were destroyed and several more damaged, all without a single loss to the British or South Africans. This was a lesson to be learnt. The British needed to separate the German tanks from their anti-tank gun screen. But the lesson wasn't learnt at the time, at least not by the higher-ups, and not until well after Crusader was over. As midday approached, the panzers moved down the valley once more, this time along the northern escarpment towards the airfield. 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment was now in trouble. It got hammered, and the pressure of the German assault took them straight through to those units of the support group still on the valley floor. The support company of the 2nd Rifle Brigade was the first to be attacked near Sidi Rezegh. When several panzers approached, the 25-pounders of 60th Field Artillery opened up on them, brewing 4 of them up. This hail of fire persuaded the Germans to withdraw and rethink their tactics, but the British knew that they would be back. In the short respite, radio messages were sent to Davy's HQ, warning him of what was happening and requesting support. But Davy accused them of firing on the 7th Hussars. So it's clear he didn't know the reality of the situation. The riflemen and gunners were now isolated in the face of the German Panzer Divisions. So Stukas hit them, then artillery, and then the panzers rolled forward again. They called Davy once more and said, nope, these definitely were German panzers. Still not believing them, Davy sent 5 Crusader tanks to the edge of the battalion area just to be sure. They were all destroyed before they could get into effective range with their 2-pounders. It was now that Davy realised that 2 Panzer Divisions had struck against his 2 tank battalions and 1 unit of artillery. He and many of the British commanders had simply misread the situation. Again, this is why the fog of war, good communications and good intelligence are critically important factors on the modern battlefield. As with logistics, most computer games, for example, do not even show these things, and most people studying history don't even consider them. In this battle though, information was simply not getting processed quick enough by higher commanders, leaving the outcome of the entire battle to the guys on the ground, the soldiers and their local officers. Jock Campbell reacted immediately. He called 60th Field Artillery and put them into action. His 25-pounders fired away as Campbell led a counter-attack with 12 British tanks. They went up against 80 panzers. Clearly they had no chance, but still managed to disperse the Germans initially. Then the Germans reformed and fired back. It is alleged that at one point Campbell was directing operations from a top erect Italian aeroplane. He was an exemplary commander and was always to be found wherever the fighting was fiercest. The 2-pounder anti-tank gun crews of the 2nd Rifle Brigade kept on firing until they were either killed or too badly wounded to continue fighting. To the north of the Rifle Brigade, 60th Field Artillery's 25-pounders kept on firing as well, with Campbell's supervision, but they too were getting overwhelmed. 21st Panzer Division moved down the valley between the southern and main escarpments, and this was the end. Each gun was knocked out in turn by overwhelming fire. And all the while, a little dog ran pathetically from slit trench to slit trench, seeking its master and attracting a hail of fire to any spot where it stopped, and made obviously friendly overtures to some subterranean figure. It appeared as though 60th Field Artillery was to be destroyed as well, but at this point the Germans concentrated on the remnants of the Rifle Brigade Support Company. They were overwhelmed by artillery, which wiped out 1 platoon and forced the battered remains of the others to dissolve into the desert to get away from the danger. The Germans were now in charge of the eastern end of the southern escarpment, and the day was clearly won by the Germans. 7th Hussars was destroyed, another tank battalion was battered, and the 7th Support Group's guns had suffered heavy losses, and the support company of the Rifle Brigade had been annihilated. In addition, the Italians and the Africa Division with Rommel support had stalled the attempt by the 32nd Army Tank Brigade to break out of Tobruk, and Kampfgruppe Weckmar had stopped the break-in attempt as well. The fighting around 2nd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment continued for the rest of the day. By evening, only 6 of the out-of-date cruisers were left, and finally the weight of British artillery fire and the German shortage of ammunition and fuel forced the Germans to retire for the day. The support group had prevented the Germans from reaching friendly forces at El Duda, but the cost was massive, with both the support group and 7th Armoured Brigade taking heavy losses. 4 commanding officers were taken out, and only 28 British tanks in 7th Armoured Brigade were still operational. Worse, 7th Hussars had been wiped out. Yes, they would be reformed and see action in the Far East, but this was the last time they would fight in the desert. 7th Armoured Brigade was wounded, but the British still had most of the 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades. The question now is, would these be enough to defeat what was pretty much still the complete Afrika Korps? Meanwhile, Cunningham had ordered Godwin Austen to push the New Zealand Division forwards in the morning. So Godwin Austen spurred the New Zealanders on and ordered the 4th Indian Division to get behind the enemy on the frontier. By noon, the New Zealanders with 1st Army Tank Brigade had got across the Traig El Abd, and by late afternoon, the New Zealander cavalry had reached Sidi Rezegh. 4th New Zealand Brigade had moved to the heights above Bardia, and 5th New Zealand Brigade had swung right along the Hafid Ridge and reached the rear of Fort Capuzzo. 6th New Zealand Brigade swung the other way towards the Tre Capuzzo to concentrate at Bir el Heriga. And 7th Indian Brigade took Libyan Omar and Sidi Omar. This was in fact a similar route they had taken when they took Tamaz and Sidi Barani the year before during Operation Compass, and they were quite confident in their task. Overall though, the 21st of November 1941 had been a good day for Rommel, and after stopping the British from either breaking in or out of Tobruk, you'd think Rommel would be happy. But no, Rommel was not happy. Rommel thought that Crüwell had failed to get the Afrika Korps through the valley to relieve the pressure on the besiegers. Rommel wasn't aware of the situation at Sidi Rezegh and was primarily concerned by the British attempt to break out at Tobruk. Perhaps his obsession with Tobruk was clouding his judgment. Relations between Crüwell and Rommel are clearly strained at this point, but they did see eye to eye on something. Crüwell was worried that his forces were encircled by a superior force, and Rommel agreed, thinking that the German units were sandwiched between the enemy units. If you look at the situation, well, less said about the positions of the units the better, but there was a growing number of British forces on the battlefield. Rommel knew that the British still had a full corps of infantry at the frontier that was prepared to join the battle. If this battle turned into a positional fight, the infantry would be the essential component, and the British had the advantage in infantry numbers. Right now though, Rommel wanted Crüwell to get closer to Axis forces outside Tobruk by taking the direct route to them. At 21:30 hours, he therefore ordered Crüwell to hold on in the Belhamid and Sidi Rezegh area. From there, he could attack with his armour and break through to the Tobruk area. For this, 115th Infantry Regiment and the Afrika Regiment were placed under Crüwell's command. But Crüwell wasn't sure that he could get through to Tobruk using the direct route, so he decided to compromise. He wanted to regroup to the east and then move down the Tre Capuzzo to Rommel. This would have the benefit of him breaking out of the encirclement his forces were in, and give them back their freedom to manoeuvre. So, Crüwell ordered 15th Panzer Division to withdraw east and regroup 7 miles south of Gambut around point 196. He also ordered 21st Panzer Division to move down the escarpment near point 175 and move along the Tre Capuzzo to Belhamid. Here, von Ravenstein would assume command of the 361st Afrika Regiment and the 155th Schutzen Regiment, who would then expel the British from the escarpment as soon as possible. These moves were carried out during the night, and for the third time in 3 days, the Afrika Korps left the field to the British. But a lack of fuel meant that some of the panzers were still south of point 175 at dawn on the 22nd. At this moment, victory seemed within sight for the British command. Only 7th Armoured Brigade and the support group had doubts, wondering why the Germans were abandoning the ground that they'd just won. Back at 8th Army HQ, confidence reigned supreme. For reasons unknown, Cunningham only seems to have received the good news, not the bad news, and the good news told him that 30 Corps had defeated the Afrika Korps. It was reported by a liaison officer that 170 panzers had been hit alone this day, which doesn't mean destroyed and could have meant 170 panzers hit them, but apparently nobody at the HQ realised this. Another report stated that 60 panzers were surrounded southeast of Sidi Rezegh, and they thought Rommel's panzer strength had been reduced by 50%. 30 Corps' tank losses seem to suggest this too, since there's no way that the British could have lost as many tanks as they had lost without doing at least equal damage to the Germans. This view also fitted in with the RAF reports of the days before, which had seen Axis forces moving westwards. Yes, 7th Armoured Division had suffered heavily, but 2 armoured brigades were intact and ready to fight. 209 British tanks were still operational in 30 Corps, and Gott was confident that he could clear up the situation around Sidi Rezegh the next day. Plus, 13th Corps was also still advancing, so to the British generals, everything seemed to be going great. Of course, the reality was that Rommel had stopped the Tobruk garrison with a scratch force and had smashed 7th Armoured Brigade with 2 Panzer Divisions, reducing the brigade to 28 tanks. But nobody seems to have realised this at the time, probably thanks to poor communications. Cunningham showed the same spirit he'd had in East Africa: energy, impatience, and a tendency to commit bold thrusts. Several problems did present themselves though. Just before 1600 hours, Scobie had received a message saying that the meeting up with 30 Corps would be postponed until the next day. And at some point in the middle of the fighting, Gott had, for some reason, ordered the 5th South African Brigade to halt. Also, by the evening of the 21st of November, the 6th New Zealand Brigade was ready to move away from the battle area towards Tobruk if Norrie needed it. So that evening, Norrie informed Cunningham that 30 Corps could not help the Tobruk sortie until the next day, and that the South Africans were nowhere to be found. Cunningham replied that speed was necessary, telling Norrie he wanted to see a link-up with the Tobruk garrison as soon as possible. But another miscommunication between Cunningham and Norrie led to Norrie declining the 6th New Zealand Brigade as reinforcements. Cunningham's only real concern at this point wasn't Rommel's panzers, which it really should have been, but was the fact that Scobie's forces hadn't linked up with 30 Corps. So Cunningham told Brigadier Harding of 13th Corps that they should advance according to their own initiative and didn't need to bother Cunningham for guidance. He did order that the New Zealanders should move west as far as possible though, because he wanted to link up with Tobruk. So, poor British communications and a misinterpretation of the facts at hand by the British generals led to the conclusion that Rommel had already been defeated. Clearly, this wasn't the case. The illusion of victory became, hour by hour, more lovely. Rain soaked everyone overnight on the 21st to 22nd of November. Despite this, 4th New Zealand Brigade reached the outskirts of Bardia. The 5th New Zealand Brigade stormed Fort Capuzzo early in the morning, which fell to the New Zealanders. 6th New Zealand Brigade moved overnight to the Trail Capuzzo and prepared for another move. At 10:30 hours, Gott called for the 5th South African Infantry Brigade, which was moving northwards, to capture part of the southern escarpment at and around point 178. In the end though, they wouldn't be in a position to attack until 1500 hours. On the other side, Crüwell wanted to regain the initiative, so 15th Panzer Division, now at Bir el Kletta, was ordered to probe westwards along the crest of the main escarpment. Also, 21st Panzer Division and Butcher's artillery group were on the southern slope of the Belhamid position. They hoped to form a defence line and stop any British attacks from Sidi Rezegh, aiming to break through to Tobruk. But Rommel suddenly appeared, and now ordered Kampfgruppe Knabe to drive the support group riflemen from the positions they'd won the previous morning. 155th Schutzen Regiment with artillery and some panzer support was also sent to the southern escarpment around Bir Kremisa. Here they were to push back any British or South African troops that they found there. The 57 tanks of 5th Panzer Regiment were ordered to go via the northern route under cover of Belhamid itself, then to El Duda, then Abia al Amar, and get around to the western end of the main escarpment. If they could sweep through the valley, they would crush the British on the airfield between themselves and 104th Schutzen Regiment attacking from the north. By this point, the panzer crews were tired, dirty, thirsty, and shaken by their battles so far. But with Rommel now in command, they felt as though they were ready to continue the fight. It's worth noting though that, for the German soldiers at this time, it didn't seem as though they were winning the battle. The British watched as 15th Panzer Division started to move back to the east. 22nd Armoured Brigade tried to engage but were forced to break off because of anti-tank elements from the German rearguards. 4th Armoured Brigade also tried to follow, but the Germans got away. 4th Armoured were then ordered to go to point 175. As they arrived, they saw the last elements of 8th Panzer Regiment depart down the Tre Capuzzo, screened by Kampfgruppe Weckmar. Meanwhile, the rest of the British forces in the area tried to repair and resupply themselves. Cunningham now arrived at 30 Corps HQ, satisfied overall with the progress so far. He now thought that because the New Zealanders were marching up, the British infantry may play a more significant role than they already had done so far. Was this an exciting new development in British combined arms doctrine, or was it an admission that they'd lost a lot of tanks and so were probably going to have to rely on infantry? Inspired by Cunningham's revelation, Norrie ordered Brink to concentrate his 2 brigades and move them up to the Sidi Rezegh area. And in order to allow this to happen, 22nd Armoured Brigade would go back to Bir el Gubi to mask the Arete Division. Yes, let's send half our remaining tanks south for no reason while the 2 German Panzer Divisions were still around. Worse, Pienaar couldn't move his brigade up until 22nd Armoured Brigade arrived, so the British would be diluting their forces at Sidi Rezegh until this swap occurred. At around 11:30 hours, the miscommunication between Cunningham and Norrie was resolved, and the 6th New Zealand Brigade received orders to head west to reinforce 7th Armoured Division. 30 Corps needed more infantry north of the main escarpment, where there was currently a gap. First though, they were ordered to a point 6 miles southwest of Gambut, Bir el Kletta. Gott then called a conference on the landing ground at 1300 hours, and said that, with the German infantry occupying the southern escarpment, there should be no attempt to break through to the Tobruk garrison until British infantry reinforced them. Once Armstrong's men had arrived, they and the support group could then push on towards El Duda early the next morning. But as Gott's conference was taking place, the panzers massed. At 1400 hours, Gott left to drive to Armstrong's HQ. Yeah, Gott drives away just as the panzers strike. Just 15 minutes later, at 14:15 hours, 5th Panzer Regiment with its 57 tanks, along with infantry and anti-tank guns, drove up the valley towards the British flank. And 104th Schutzen Regiment from 21st Panzer Division readied themselves to hit the British from the north. But as the panzers approached, the 25-pounders of the 4th Royal Horse Artillery opened up first, followed by the guns of Campbell's support group. Shells from the Panzer IVs exploded amongst the gunners. And now, unlike the previous day's fighting on the other side of the airfield, there was no sign of an easement of the pressure, as panzers, flak guns, the crouching, leapfrogging knots of German infantry edged inexorably forward despite the weight of steel flung against them. 22nd Armoured Brigade reacted and moved up to positions under the southern escarpment, passing through the gunners of 60th Field Artillery. They then moved on through the 4th Royal Horse Artillery positions and went forward to engage the panzers. At this point, the gunners sighed with relief, knowing the British tanks were going into action. But this breather was short-lived. The British tanks were hopelessly outmatched and soon went up in flames. As they retreated, the gunners quickly remanned their guns and continued the fight. Smoke and dust filled the air and choked visibility for both sides as they grappled with each other in a confusing mess. With British command completely out of touch with reality, the fight was once again left to the local leaders, who refused to back down. Brigadier Jock Campbell was the most senior commander in the area and took matters into his own hands. 7th Support Group was a mixed artillery and infantry unit, and Campbell was a gunner, having come from the Royal Horse Artillery. His actions now would go down as a legend in the North African campaign. He drove around the battlefield, standing up in his unarmoured staff car, waving a red flag to direct his men. He rallied the remnants of 7th Armoured Brigade in the area and led them, yes, led them, in his unarmoured staff car, through the lines of his own artillery and into the mass of panzers beyond. Shells burst alongside him, machine gun bullets, shell splinters and pebbles pockmarked his car, but wherever the action was most furious, the tall figure was there, stiff, aristocratic features more and more obscured under the cake of dust and grime, the voice hoarser but the energy never flagging. The Germans were impressed by the stubbornness of the British artillery, who kept firing despite the odds against them. But even with this support, the morale of the British tank crews was beginning to suffer. After a few local attacks, the tanks seemed reluctant to go back into the fight. And when they did go in, they only did so for progressively smaller lengths of time. This allowed the German infantry to get closer and closer to the British anti-tank guns, and because the German Panzer IV tanks outranged the British guns, they had no choice but to fall back. One panzer force pushed the artillery back to the southeast, the other moved northeast into the rear of the British infantry dug in on the Sidi Rezegh ridge. 1st Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps were holding against Kampfgruppe Knabe, supported by Butcher's artillery unit who were attacking them from the north. Unable to move, the panzers now crushed them. Hit from behind with their ammunition running low, A and C companies of the 1st Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps were overrun. D Company was accompanied by tanks, but even this was not enough. These guys had fought since the first salvos of Operation Compass at Sofafi, but in the afternoon of this day, the majority of 1st Battalion disintegrated. The commanding officer of 1st Battalion, Sidney de Salis, surrendered to the Germans. B Company was elsewhere and was able to reform the battalion later, but for now, 1st Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps ceased to exist. The hard fighting around Sidi Rezegh airfield on this day, and in the coming days, resulted in 4 Victoria Crosses. Campbell of the support group was one of those to get the Victoria Cross, but this was in the future. At this moment, the Germans had complete control of the Sidi Rezegh ridge. The British had also lost the airfield, and the struggle around the airfield raged on. 60th Field Artillery formed another gun line to the south. Plus, thanks to the efforts of Jock Campbell, the British rallied again and kept fighting. With the odds against them, the British tank crews were reluctant to go back into the fray. So Campbell now had to drive off towards the German lines alone in order to convince the British tankmen to follow. What could we do? We couldn't let the bastard go back on his own, could we? Not in that bloody little staff car. With a large part of the support group overrun or driven off to the south, things were looking desperate, but it was okay. The 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades were arriving on the scene and would finally get to grips with the Germans. Right? Not really. 22nd Armoured Brigade arrived first, an hour and a half before the 4th, and got hit by heavy anti-tank gun fire. Discouraged by the smoke and the dust of the battle raging before them, they decided not to engage and stood on the sidelines firing into the smoke rather than actually commit to a proper attack. What heroes. Slightly further south, having been ordered to take point 178, the 5th South African Brigade went into the attack at 1500 hours. The lead battalion, 3rd Transvaal Scottish, with artillery support from 8 field guns, attacked against a wadi to the east of point 178. They got pinned down by a Stuka attack and fire from the 155th Schutzen Regiment. They lost their colonel and second in command, and suffered 117 casualties. Armstrong decided to withdraw 5th South African Infantry Brigade 2 miles southeast that evening. At 1530 hours, the 108 tanks of 4th Armoured Brigade arrived in the area south of point 175. However, not all of them arrived in time. Those that did were the M3 light tanks of 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, not Crusaders. Still, it was better than nothing. Crüwell's tanks were also taking losses, although the fight so far had favoured the Germans. Also unknown to the British, both battalions of panzers from 5th Panzer Regiment and their anti-tank batteries were running low on ammunition. As a result, the battles slowly moved northwards across the airfield, which by this point was covered with vehicle wrecks and smashed guns. The dust cloud of the battle began to thin, showing the panzers withdrawing towards the main escarpment, currently in the hands of Kampfgruppe Knabe. So, Jock Campbell arrived at 4th Armoured Brigade's area, got out his red flag and led 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment into battle, just as the withdrawal was taking place. This attack was beaten off by 5th Panzer Regiment, which subsequently withdrew to rearm and refuel. After all the action was over, Gott returned to the battlefield and quickly called a conference with Gatehouse, Scott Coburn and Campbell. Campbell was slightly wounded, having been hit under the arm as he waved his flag. It was impossible to know how badly the Germans had suffered, but Gott knew that things hadn't gone well for the British. Effectively, 7th Armoured Brigade no longer existed as a capable fighting force. 22nd Armoured Brigade had 49 tanks left out of the 79 they started the day with. Yes, 4th Armoured Brigade still had 100 M3 light tanks, and this was the largest British tank force left in action, but these would be outgunned and outranged by the Panzers. As for the support group, no one yet knew the price they had paid for the fame which would be theirs once the story of that afternoon became known. At this point, Gott received news that 15th Panzer Division was now on the move and was heading their way. Concerned that his whole division might get annihilated, he decided that he would have to withdraw his 3 brigades from the battlefield. If they fell back to a position south of the southern escarpment where the 5th South African Brigade was expected to be, maybe they could concentrate their forces and gather enough strength to continue the battle. It seemed like the only option. And we will find out if Gott can resist 5th Panzer Division's attack in the next episode. Yes, we've seen the British completely mess this up, and you're probably sat there thinking, things couldn't get much worse than this. Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. Next week's episode will be titled Sunday of the Dead, which is a very relevant title. Crüwell and those Panzer Divisions are not done yet, and for the British, those dominoes just keep on falling. Keep on falling. Thanks for watching, bye for now.